Welcome to our webinar today, Building a System of Great Schools, the What, So What, and Now What. My name is Jackie Bernisky, and I'm with the REL Southwest. Thank you so much for joining us, and if you haven't done so already, please introduce yourself in the Introductions chat pod by sharing your role and your organization. We have a very full agenda for you today, and we're very excited about this webinar. We had over 130 registrants, and we thank you for joining us today. First, we're going to get a national perspective on school portfolio management, and after that, we're going to hear from Cleveland Metropolitan School District and their experience in this area. We will pause and have our first questions and discussion section, and then we will continue with the conversation with CMSD, followed by a brief overview of the Texas System of Great Schools, and then another question and discussion session. These are our presenters. Susan Therriault will be sharing the national perspective, and Star Wallen and Eric Gordon, the CEO of Cleveland Metropolitan School District, will have a conversation sharing with us the work of CMSD. And finally, we'll hear from Mark Hirschenfeld with the Texas Education Agency. This webinar comes to you through the REL Southwest, and we are funded through the Institute of Education Sciences. The REL Southwest serves the states of Arkansas, Louisiana, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Texas, and we currently work through our 8 research alliances. We have partnered today with the Texas Education Agency and the Texas Comprehensive Center to bring you this webinar. Our goal today, as briefly mentioned in the agenda, is to share research-based strategies around school portfolio management. Specifically, we're addressing the school performance framework, policy, and decision-making cycle. So with our outcomes, we are hoping that you'll become, of course, more aware of these features. And at the end of the webinar, we have a stakeholder feedback survey that it's very important for us to have you complete so we can learn how we can meet your needs in the future. We will be becoming familiar with one district, the Cleveland Metropolitan School District, and learning a little bit more about the work of the Texas Education Agency in Texas. And we hope that you will be able to apply all the information you've learned today to your context and where you work. We're now going to move forward with our national perspective on school portfolio management and hear from Susan Therriault.
Thanks, Jackie. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Therriault. I am a managing researcher at the American Institute for Research, or AIR, and I've spent the bulk of my career focused on state and district strategies to turn around the lowest performing schools. And more recently, as a researcher partnering with policymakers and practitioners to start to build evidence for real strategies that do lead to improvements in student outcomes in schools, as well as sustained improvement over time. So I'm really thankful for all of you that are joining and the ability to present with the others on this webinar. I think this is a really exciting opportunity, and I'm glad you could join us. So some of you may have heard about the portfolio management approach to district management, and I want to say that there are also some examples of states taking some of the tenets of portfolio management to address the needs of the lowest performing schools. So I think there's some application at both the district and the state levels. And I'll discuss some of these tenets and the state example later in the presentation. And you'll get to hear a more in-depth presentation on a district approach as well. So first, I want to begin with the origins of the portfolio management approach. The approach is really driven by what are dubbed continuous improvement strategies in other industries. And so one example of that type of industry is healthcare. And you're probably thinking, you know, what does that have to really do with education? There's often some things that cross over, however. And I think really what the underlying ideas within these efforts is to take a look at large systems and where the nested key delivery centers are, in this case schools, are located, and how they are dealing with meeting the expectations of high levels of student outcomes in our case, or student success, and identifying where the bottlenecks and boundaries or rules that are impeding the ability to maximize these outcomes. So as we are all more than likely aware, systems like systems of education at the state and district levels are with a purpose really designed in the guise of what TIAC calls the one best system. And that is a system of education that really adequately and dare I say approaches or tries to equitably serve all, or at least the majority of students well. The one best system's hallmarks are consistency, and it creates systems in which school leaders are often delegated to middle management roles that are dictated by leaders and rules from a central office. The strategy has its benefits of ensuring that there are economies of scale and efficiencies gained in common strategies such as curriculum, professional development, textbooks, etc. But I think it's safe to say that this approach does not and is not serving all students well. And while the system often works for the middle and upper class segments of our society who have seemed to benefit greatly from these, we know that it does not consistently serve our most economically disadvantaged students, not to mention the high proportions of English learners and students with disabilities that are also in these same schools. The portfolio approach is characterized by push-down decisions to the school leaders, with the theory that the school leader is the individual who knows what the students in the school need and how to make decisions about supporting these needs. So there's some variation in the types of autonomy that are granted to these school leaders, but they can include oversight, overstaffing, curriculum, instruction, professional development, the school calendar, the school day, budget, and operations. And the idea is that with these autonomies, a school leader can orchestrate these inputs to best support the specific needs of the students in the school. So now there are still some parameters around these autonomies, and that is the district or state establishes, with inputs from key stakeholders, a set of metrics and indicators that establish expectations for these schools and provide guidance on the qualities of a high-performing school. The approach is purposely designed to have triggers for high-stakes decisions as schools do not meet these expectations, but also allows for the provision of formative feedback and support before these high-stakes decisions are made. The Center for Reinventing Public Education, recognizing a growing trend in the use of portfolio management approach, identified 7 critical components of just such a system. And you can see them here. They're good options and choices for all families, school autonomy, people-based funding for all students, talent-seeking strategy, sources of support for schools or formative metrics, performance-based accountability for schools or summative metrics, and extensive public engagement. So today, we're really going to focus on number 5, formative metrics, and 6, summative metrics. It is, however, important to note that none of these are mutually exclusive, and there is and should be a fair amount of interaction between each of these components. For example, extensive public engagement is a critical piece, which you'll hear about, and that informs all aspects of this approach, and that continuous engagement of stakeholders ensures the buy-in of these key groups, which is an essential component of this type of management strategy. So really, the portfolio metrics and indicators establish a vision for schools, and they must be designed in a way that honors the autonomy with which schools are able to operate while clearly articulating the expectations for them. There are 2 types of measures. These include summative metrics, which are really based on school outputs, student outcomes. And I think we're all familiar with these types of measures, and that can include student achievement, attendance, growth, etc. Frequently, these are the starting point for designing a portfolio system, and with these summative metrics, the system must also establish timelines and triggers. So, for example, the recent SIG funding had a timeline of 3 years, and performance after that period of time was assessed, and then if performance was not improved, it could trigger either an exit decision, or if it was improved, or if it was not, a further accountability measure. So the formative indicators should really be aligned to these summative metrics and focus on process types of indicators. Feedback for schools on these indicators will really inform their continuous improvement efforts on a routine basis and can support a district or state in determining ways in which it might target support to a school based on their specific needs. Again, these frame the entire system and really need to be aligned with the priorities of stakeholders, and so that's where your engagement of the stakeholders really comes in. So later, like I said, we'll provide an in-depth example of a district, but I wanted to share an example of how a state might use some of these tenets. So Massachusetts has developed a system focused on state's lowest performing for the state's lowest performing schools and crossing into a number of districts. So these schools are located throughout the state in a number of different districts throughout the state. And then through law and state leadership granting autonomies to these schools that are identified as low performing, they're granted autonomy over staffing, governance, budget, curriculum, and instruction. And for those that schools that do not meet the summative metrics after an established time period, there are options for changing the format of the school, either through receivership, using a management organization to run the school while it is still considered a district school, or even using new options. They're very open to alternatives, such as the teachers union overseeing one of the schools. The summative metrics are typical of those in states, so I'm sure they will be recognizable to folks, and these will change somewhat as this state and others begin to implement the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. But what's really important and maybe different than some other states is that the state has a couple of key provisions. That is, there is a way that a strategy they have to balance the needs of schools, so the numbers of low-performing schools, with the state's capacity to provide support to them. And by limiting the number of schools that can be identified at any one point in time, they thus are putting some boundaries on the state's ability to direct support vis-a-vis resources to these schools and districts. Additionally, the state purposefully injects high doses of autonomy and flexibility that the schools can use in order to spur innovation and free leaders to serve their students well within the boundaries of a typical district. So along with the summative metrics, Massachusetts has developed formative indicators that are grounded in research on Massachusetts schools that have successfully turned around and sustained improvement. In this way, these formative indicators are aligned with summative metrics, and there are 4 key turnaround practices that they've identified. Leadership, with turnaround practice 1 is leadership, and this means the school has established a community of practice through leadership, shared responsibility, and professional collaboration. For turnaround practice 2, it's improving instruction, which means the school employs intentional practices for continually improving teacher-specific and student-responsive instruction. Turnaround practice 3 is focused on student supports, which means the school has established a climate and culture that provide a safe, orderly, and respectful environment for students, and a collegial and collaborative and professional culture among teachers that supports the school's focusing on increasing student achievement. And finally, turnaround practice 4 focuses on climate and culture, and this is really focusing on the school's ability to provide student-specific supports and interventions informed by data and the identification of student-specific needs. Now, I'm pretty sure no one's going to be very surprised by these, but it's what they found looking at data on Massachusetts schools that have turned around. And so each of these turnaround practices has a set of companion indicators for which there's a rubric of implementation. These are the formative measures, and the indicators focus on strategies present in schools that have turned around and are used to provide formative feedback to the schools in terms of where they are and where they need to go. So this is the rubric that is an example or an excerpt from the rubric that is used for annual actionable feedback. And the link here provides the full rubric for you. What's important to note here is that there is both information provided to the school by an external review intended to guide continuous improvement efforts, and it is also a means by which the state and the district can identify areas in which the school is struggling and offer targeted support to the school. So if you're interested, like I said, in the full rubric, the link is below. I'm going to go on to the next slide, please. So I'm sure you're wondering, in this time of evidence-based strategies and lots of pressures around that, what is the evidence for this work? So regarding the portfolio management strategy at the district level, there are several descriptive studies focused on specific districts that have implemented this model that suggest improvement trends in terms of student outcomes in some of the districts that do employ this method. Additionally, at the state level, the primary example that I provided in Massachusetts, as I mentioned, these are based on data collected through monitoring site visits to low-performing schools and then further analyzed to compare and contrast differences between schools that turned around and those that did not. Massachusetts, through this work, uses the extant data collected through the formative feedback or monitoring efforts, which has been designed to be valid and reliable and use rigorous data collection and evaluation methods for each school, and to further understand and continually improve these indicators. So there's a combination of providing this external feedback to the school, but also at the state level, continuously improving the system to make sure they're emphasizing the right things. And there have been several descriptive studies that focus on implementation in these schools, and more recently, an impact study that demonstrates that students in schools that receive formative feedback along with school improvement grant funds perform better in English language arts and mathematics state assessments, and also decrease the achievement gap between low-income and higher-income students, as well as the decrease in the achievement gap between English learners and not English learners. This is interesting because it bucks the national studies that have indicated that schools did not actually improve under SIG. So there's a little bit of a difference here, and we're still exploring why that is. For more information about these, I will, there's some links in the chat box, but I'll also share some links at the end of this presentation. So while the preliminary evidence of this approach suggests that this may be a strategy that leads to improved student outcomes, more research is definitely needed. And it's clear that there are many challenges to implementing what could be a very complex and potentially politically fraught system. Specifically, some of the challenges identified in studies focused on portfolio management in particular included that the summative measures, those measures such as student assessment scores and attendance, are often highly developed when starting to implement a portfolio management system, but the formative indicators are often a little underdeveloped or at least lagging behind those. So I'm sure there are many reasons for this. I would venture to guess that many of the reasons are centered around the fact that folks don't really know what these formative indicators are or should be, and it also takes time to balance the notion of what the strategy should be, kind of the level of touch, or versus, kind of dictating or prescribing programs. So that can be quite challenging. Another big challenge is stakeholder buy-in and maintaining stakeholder buy-in over time, as it can pose, without the stakeholder buy-in, you don't have your finger on the pulse of what's going on in terms of these key stakeholders, and perhaps communication, two-way communication is not as open. And then finally, one of the biggest challenges to this approach is leadership and turnover in leadership. So in many ways, to do this work, the leaders really need to be prepared to make what can be very challenging decisions about placing a school in, making a high-stakes decision about a school, such as placing in receivership or under some sort of different leadership model. But this can be politically challenging for leaders, and thus a wide net of support beyond that of a single individual is necessary to be able to consistently implement such a system when there is a natural occurrence of a turnover of leaders. There is some evidence that a portfolio framework that has buy-in from key stakeholders. So some strategies to mitigate these challenges is, one main one is to continually engage these key stakeholders, as they can support you and support a leader in challenging decisions and mitigate some of the impact of a turnover in district leadership. Additionally, consistency and commitment to implementation is really important. You need to say you need to do what you're saying you're going to do, because that actually brings the stakeholders and aligns some of the vision and keeps things on track. And then finally, it is very challenging to grant individual schools full autonomy, and it really shifts the way a district and or state operates. And so there needs to be some training around granting this autonomy and giving schools the space to use it, but also for leaders to be able to use this autonomy in ways that are meaningful and can support students. So I mentioned quite a bit of resources, and there are certainly more. This slide provides a few resources for your consideration, including a research brief on some of the Massachusetts work, a rubric for scoring portfolio strategies that was developed by the Center for Reinventing Public Education. And they actually have some studies on that website that focus on their ratings of different portfolio management implementation in districts across the United States. And then finally, a field guide focused on the turnaround practices and indicators and what those look like actually in practice. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Susan, for that overview, and we'll move forward to our next presenters, Dar Wallen and Eric Gordon.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks, Susan. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. I'll provide just a quick introduction of myself before we get started. I'm the founder and leader of Bell Creek Consulting, where we serve mission-driven organizations with a particular emphasis in our work on the education to employment continuum. And a lot of our team has a huge passion for education. It's been in my family's business for over 4 generations, and I've been fortunate to work in education as both a teacher in DC public schools and at the strategy level with firms like McKinsey & Company, and now, of course, in my capacity with Bell Creek. Portfolio work, to me, is so important because it's the powerful linkage between strategy and the daily experiences of students in schools. And I've had the great privilege of working alongside visionary leaders like Eric Gordon, who's joining this webinar today, of Cleveland Metropolitan Schools, along with leaders in School District of Philadelphia and most recently districts across Texas via the Texas Education Agency's System of Great Schools work on this particular work in portfolio management. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you all today and to share the collective work that's been going on around the country and hopefully break it down in a way that is helpful to you wherever you are in your journey. So speaking of where you are in your journey, Eric and I wanted to run through a set of rapid-fire poll and chat questions to help us really cater today's conversation to be most helpful to you. And then, of course, on the flip side, give you a bit of a preview of what parts of our presentation might be most relevant for you and your team. So these questions that are coming up now talk about your district. So I'd ask, if you're not currently affiliated with the district, because I know we have folks in a number of different roles joining today, that you please reflect on a district with which you've interacted in recent years as you answer these questions. So our first poll question is, does your district currently have a commonly understood definition of school quality? You'll see we have 4 answer choices. These will repeat for all of our poll questions. So ranging from the most certain, yes, absolutely, this is well developed for our district, to no, we're not there yet. This does not exist in the district where I currently work or in the district that I'm thinking of when I'm responding to this question. So if everyone can take a second and click on the answer that best reflects your experience, we'll give another few seconds. We're going to march through these pretty quickly. And if you're having any trouble with the polling technology or figuring out what to do, just let us know via the questions and discussion box. Okay, one more second to finish entering your answers. And great. So it looks like of the folks that responded, there's a large number of individuals kind of in these 2 middle categories. So some progress, we're really stepping into the work of defining school quality, or starting the conversation, starting to move down that journey. So that's helpful to understand. Let's go ahead and move to the next poll question. This question is, has your district leadership team taken action to promote a high-performing school or improve a low-performing school? So sorry, the question's a little bit cut off, but the question here is really, are you familiar with your district actually intervening in either schools that are high-performing to provide more students access to them, or taking action in schools that are low-performing? Great. Take another 2 seconds to finish logging your answers to this. Perfect. So it sounds like actions in schools are pretty common among this group, and no worries if that's not the case for you currently, but that's helpful to understand. And actually, the next question is a chat question. So in the chat pod, we'd actually like you to respond for those of you who do have examples of school action being taken in a district that you're thinking of, or in the district where you currently are working. Can you help us understand what are some examples of those actions that you're thinking of when you respond to that question? I would love for you in the questions and discussion box just to type out what are the types of actions that come to mind when you think about what your district has done to intervene in schools. Great. Add instructional coaches, bring in a redesign partner, some professional development, or moving school leadership. I see that there's some school quality reviews targeted at the lowest performing schools. Turnaround zones being used also for lowest performing schools. Yep, great, fantastic. So I see that there is clearly already a diversity of tools that folks on the webinar are using or have seen used in districts. And so we'll talk as we get into the school performance policy section about how other districts have organized those tools and really leveraged them to the maximum impact for students. All right, let's move on to the next poll question. This question asks, does your district's definition of school quality map to a clear set of school actions? So for those of you that have seen school actions be taken in the districts you're thinking of, can you back map those actions to a definition of school quality? So low performing schools get certain actions, high performing schools receive different actions. Okay, I'm going to broadcast those results. Looks like this is something that that nobody feels is fully, or few people feel is really fully well developed in their districts currently, and in some cases this is on the early stages. Okay, and next to last question for folks to respond to. Does your district have a predictable, transparent, fact-based process for making decisions about school action? Give folks a couple more seconds to answer that and go ahead and share the results as they're coming in. Great. Okay. So again, sounds like we've got a bit of a distribution here, but acknowledgement that there are the majority of folks that are answering on the early side of this part of the journey of really making sure that the process for decision making is predictable and transparent and understood. And actually, on that point, the last question that we wanted to ask about is, would district stakeholders, and when we talk about stakeholders, we're talking about in district and external to the district structure, so students, families, community stakeholders, be able to explain how school quality relates to actions that the district might take in schools. Great, and go ahead and I'm sharing out now how folks are responding. All right. So again, it feels like we've got a broad spectrum of experiences represented on today's conversation, and I think that's a helpful place to be because we can all learn from each other and share different points. I think I will say that our conversation is oriented a bit more towards those folks that are early in this journey, but certainly happy to continue the conversation offline and in the future to go into more detail as is helpful for those folks that are really moving forward in the work and a bit more mature at this point. If we can move back to the slides, we're going to go ahead and launch into the content that really maps quite well to these questions that we talked about. So school portfolio management, when we say that term, it's really about systematically intervening in schools to help more students access high-quality education. And our conversation today, like the questions we just walked through, is going to focus on three major topics. So first, we're going to talk about defining school quality, the school performance framework here, really getting to the heart of what indicates a great school. We'll then turn to design choices districts face when building a policy that maps school quality to potential school actions, getting crisp on the so what of a school quality rating. And finally, our discussion is going to cover the elements of a best-in-class decision-making process. Really, how do you routinize the challenging work of prioritizing which schools to focus on in a given year and providing all district stakeholders with a clear plan to answer the question, okay, now what do we do? So as Susan mentioned, we're going to talk a lot about districts and schools, but absolutely this concept is one that can be applied at the state level to a portfolio of districts, at a school level to a portfolio of programs that you're considering. And so I'd ask that you kind of take the word district and the framing that we're using today and extrapolate out how this can be a useful concept wherever you find your work currently. For each of these sections, Eric and I are going to do a bit of tag team presenting, so I'll share an overview and best practices, and then Eric is going to provide insight into how those best practices have been applied in Cleveland Metropolitan Schools, which has quite a mature portfolio strategy underway. And we've set aside 2 clear points in the agenda to discuss questions that come up along the way, but please feel free as we go along to log your questions in the question and discussion chat pod there so that we can be logging those as we go. And I'll go ahead and say it at the start. We have an aggressive agenda, and I'm sure we're going to be only able to scratch the surface on these really exciting topics. So I want to go ahead and offer, as I already have, to follow up offline if there's things that you felt like you didn't get the real meat of that you were hoping to understand. So I'm going to venture to guess that, sorry, let me move the slide there. All right, I'm going to venture to guess that if we put up a poll question asking who comes from a district where you have infinite resources to take any and all actions necessary to help students access high-quality schools, where you have 0 constraints and all opportunities, nobody would raise their hand to identify their district as that situation. The reality of working towards mission-critical objectives while operating in resource-constrained environments is, of course, shared in many contexts. Right? Your counterparts at USAID are really deciding each day whether the incremental dollar goes to providing access to clean drinking water or to malaria prevention. Right? In the national security context, the FBI has to think about how to deploy its finite intelligence analysts and agents to really minimize the threat to security of American citizens. And even around your dinner table, right? I'm sure there's been conversations about how best to deploy your limited resources across the many worthy potential areas of investment. So while I can certainly appreciate that folks may have an initial reaction to this concept of portfolio management, as something that comes from the private sector and doesn't really have a clear application to education, where the bottom line is clearly not profit. Portfolio management is ultimately about the hard work of making trade-offs to maximize impact in resource-constrained, mission-driven environments. So it's incredibly relevant, as Susan mentioned. And whatever you call it, we're going to throw out a lot of terms. Feel free to take or leave those terms that resonate with you. But I think the reality that I would venture to say is that regardless of the terminology you use, the likelihood is that you're already doing this work, right? It may be implicit. It may not be understood by all stakeholders. And if that's the case, if you haven't yet made it explicit and brought it into the light, then you're potentially missing a critical opportunity to ensure that decisions that you're making are maximizing impact for students. So at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Eric to talk a bit about how Cleveland came to embrace the school portfolio strategy.
Thanks, Star, and hello, everyone. I wanted to just start very quickly to tell you about why Cleveland even embraced the portfolio strategy in the first place, because I think it helps in our cities and in communities to understand why would you do this. And there really were three catalytic events in our short history that are the answer to our why. In 1976, we had forced busing through desegregation. In 1995, we became one of the first two cities in the country that had parochial school vouchers. And in 1997, Ohio dramatically expanded charter schools. And so you can see just by the enrollment of the district, we lost more than half of our students because families increasingly had choices, even while the district leadership at the time kept saying, well, they shouldn't be allowed to choose. They shouldn't be allowed to choose. And so in 2011, we embraced the portfolio strategy, which means that now families not only have choices to leave the district, but they have choices inside of the district too. If you want to know more about Cleveland, there is a fast fact sheet. People always say, well, yeah, will it work here? We are a district with 39,000 students, a majority-minority district, and so very typical of what many of us struggle with collectively across the country, and you can see the fact sheet attached. The core of our theory of action is that if we embrace the fact that families choose, then we also need to empower our schools to educate that school that family chooses to really do a great job at educating, and that the district shifts its role into a support center. And so, you know, we have spent a lot of time and energy really focusing on those three shifts, embracing the notion that families choose, really empowering and entrusting our schools through autonomies and supports to educate kids well, and then finally the district turning itself into a support center for our schools. We have a bold goal. Our goal in Cleveland is to triple the number of kids sitting in a high-performing school and to eliminate all failing schools from our city. And you'll notice that it's district and charter. As part of choice, we have stopped trying to fight about who should own children and start trying to focus on what is quality for kids in Ohio. And our reform plan, the Cleveland plan, embraces this notion of high-performing and low-performing through partnerships, including those with our charter partners. As you heard earlier, this is based on the portfolio strategy from the Center for Reinventing Public Education. We've shared the link for you in the chat box. Here are the two pieces of it that really focus on families choosing, so a lot of public engagement and good options for families. Then there's this section that is all about empowering schools, so autonomies, funding, and talent-seeking strategy. And then finally, sources of support and accountability. And we're going to spend most of our time in the accountability section and how we've implemented in our discussion in Cleveland. And with that setup, I'm going to turn it back to Star to dig us into the content.
Thanks, Eric. So let's launch into the first section, a school performance framework. It's really about aligning parents and families, decision makers, and your school teams on a common, fair, consistent, and accurate measuring stick for school quality. You don't have to be an avid sports fan to know what it means when a referee throws up his hands, right? So similarly, the goal of establishing a school quality framework is really to ensure that all stakeholders, no matter where they come from in your community, can identify great schools. And without a school performance framework, you may find efforts to discuss and improve school quality are confusing at best and counterproductive at worst. much like a football game might be if everyone, the players, the coaches, the refs, the fans, were not fully aligned around the goal of making it to the end zone. So to talk about what comprises a school quality framework, the tricky part about this work is that there's really no single measure that can accurately capture school quality. And to address this challenge, most districts marry a number of academic and non-academic measures. I'm not going to spend a ton of time going in depth here because the poll question suggested that these conversations are really underway and on most of the districts or contexts of folks that are on the webinar today. But suffice to say, there's a lot more complexity that goes into this than we'll be able to cover. But I will say on the academic side, it's very common to see that absolute performance and student growth are two cornerstones of a school quality measure. And more districts are also incorporating outcome measures around graduation rates and college and career readiness to really make sure the focus is on student life success. Districts are able to further bring nuance and important contextualization to this data by comparing these measures to peer groups, whether in district or across the state, or really zooming in to capture what's happening with subgroups of populations like students with disabilities or English language learners, a lot of what Susan talked about in her opening presentation. And really the academic measures tend to be what anchor school performance frameworks across the board. But districts are also recognizing that things like having a safe and affirming learning environment, ensuring that students show up to school, that discipline stats are tracked, that parental satisfaction is part of the equation, are all really critical in enabling student success. I think we have some folks from Oakland on the line, and I know there, for instance, their school quality framework is split 60-40 between academic and social emotional measures. So you'll often see this blended approach that districts are taking. And while most of these measures on both sides can be quantified, there are some that benefit from a more qualitative evaluation, such as an in-person school visit. As you heard Susan mention, this is something that the state of Massachusetts has done. So I wanted to share a few tips from the field as it relates to school performance framework before I hand it over to Eric to talk about how this is manifest in Cleveland. First, it's impossible to 100% accurately capture school quality, even with a multidimensional framework. There's always going to be an additional dimension you want to incorporate, an additional way to cut the data to make it more nuanced. But at some point, your team has to make the call on how you balance accuracy with the need to make sure the measure is not too cumbersome to calculate and not too cumbersome to explain to your ultimate end users. On the point of end users, it's quite critical to have those end users in mind and around the table as you're building out these performance frameworks. And by end users, I mean the senior leaders of your school district that are ultimately going to be the decision makers about what actions will be taken, school teams whose daily work with students will be reflected by this measure and driven by this measure, and of course parents and families who will use the school quality framework to help inform their decisions about where to send their students. Actually, one helpful way of striking that balance, the first point we talked about, is actually to enlist these end users as thought partners as you build out your school performance framework. And when it comes time to debut this type of framework, it's hugely important for stakeholder buy-in to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with parents and principals that help shape the definition of school quality for your district. Finally, would encourage you not to reinvent the wheel on this one in particular. There are many exemplar school performance frameworks already in place in districts across the nation, in Philadelphia, in Denver, in Oakland, in Cleveland. There's really no reason to go through the struggle and kind of relive the pitfalls of building out a school quality framework from scratch when you can use these proven models as a starting point for discussion. And with that, I'll hand it over to have Eric talk about how they handled this part of the work in Cleveland.
So the first thing in Cleveland that we did was get really clear on what had to sit behind our work. And so what you're seeing on the screen are our 5 principles that sat behind the design of all of our tools. Because our time is really short, I'm going to not spend a lot of time on them, but you will have this in the slide deck. But essentially, we were going through aggressive change in how our system here in Ohio was working. And so we were looking for stability, things that we could count on for the foreseeable future. We needed it to be defensible, credible, that people believed in it. We needed it to be clear and transparent and pass the sniff test, not just technically clear, but that people really got it and really trusted and believed in it. We needed to be able to get data for all schools, including charter schools, since our portfolio strategy includes both, so it couldn't be district-centric. And finally, it had to accommodate many points of view. So how does it interact with our state report card? How does it interact with other public and private alliances in the city and what their expectations are? So these principles sit behind the work that we designed in Cleveland, and this is the output of those principles. So our school quality framework has two dimensions. On the left-hand side, our state's performance index grade, which every school gets and has been fairly stable even as we have changed and evolved the state assessment system. And then across the bottom, either the value-added grade for K-8 schools or the four-year high school graduation rate for high schools. And you can see then how getting those two grades helps us to sort out the various levels of performance, from highest performing to mid-performing to low-performing or failing. And it even further discriminates, why are you low-performing? Are you low-performing because you're not growing kids, or are you low-performing because you are not yet proficient, which are two kind of different distinguishers. We actually use this also as part of our public reporting. And so we've just shared a link in the chat box to the Cleveland Transformation Alliance, where our public in Cleveland can see the performance for all of our schools, district and charter, against this measure. But we also, as Susan said, use a lot of formative data. And so sitting behind this is what we call the School Performance and Planning Framework. And it looks at things like school environment and school operations as a way to get to closing gaps, moving progress, and ultimately achieving student performance and having students prepared for success. In this, we use a lot of different data sets. So for example, we do use school quality reviews that we've trained teams here in the district to do, to walk through schools in a 2.5-day visit and provide a very deep level of qualitative feedback. We also use things like environment and attendance data, conditions for learning survey data to understand the student experience, as just some examples. This tool is actually electronic and is coded to demography, so that if I'm in a school, I can look for other schools with similar characteristics to mine, and I can then quickly go and visit schools that are getting better results with similar kids and use that as part of my professional learning and improvement in my school. And then finally, we've combined both the formative and summative together over time. Ohio has updated our accountability system with aggressive new learning standards that we needed to put in place, but essentially pushed all of our schools to low or failing school status. And so we needed to further discriminate. And so we're now able to take these two elements together, the school performance and planning framework, which shows us whether a school is below average, average, or above average compared to their peers, and the school quality framework trend over time. Are they trending better, holding steady, or declining, to further segregate and look at where schools are performing. And again, I'll turn it back to Star for any questions in this portion of our presentation.
Well, thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Eric, Star, and Susan. We did have registrants post questions when they registered for this event, and so we can address a couple of those, but we really invite all of our attendees who are online today to post any questions that you may have for any of our presenters. We'll go ahead and start with one from registration. Susan, could you address this, and maybe Star would follow up? What portfolio management strategies are essential for school district success?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jackie. I think that's a really good question, and I've seen different frameworks for this, but I do have to say the rubric that the Center for Reinventing Public Education developed really nicely articulates the 7 components and what that looks like on a rubric in terms of implementation and some of the challenges within it. So I highly encourage you to take a look at that. Of course, anytime we're creating categories, they're not perfect, and they're not mutually exclusive categories. So they do interact with one another. But I think it's a nice representation of things that you need to be attentive to as a leader when you're thinking about this work. Star, do you want to add some things?
Sure. I would just say I can appreciate that the 7 elements of portfolio strategy and even the double click we're doing today on school portfolio management can feel overwhelming. And so I think what are the most important pieces to start with, what are the most important pieces for school success, it really has to do with your district context and thinking about the broader environment in which you're operating, the assets that you have at your disposal. And I can guarantee you that districts like Denver and Cleveland that are well along the journey towards implementing this strategy did not start perfectly and did not start on all fronts all at once. And so I think there's a roadmap that you can build that really helps in your own specific pathway to success think about how to deploy these strategies.
Thank you. I think we'll go ahead. If y'all see the question from Amber, she asked, and I believe this would be for Eric, and we can go back to the slide. If everything is comparative, does that mean there will always be schools in the red square, or can all schools make it to the dark green if they perform well enough?
Yeah, thank you, Amber, for asking. I want to be really clear that this is not intended to set up winners and losers. It is intended that every school can get to the light green and dark green. Where we use the comparative data is once you know where you sit, who has similar demography as you, who has similar students, and how are they doing so that you can find learning places inside of the district. And then we combine those two in this panel to be able to say, you know, so if I happen to be in a failing school here, okay, so am I failing but doing better than most, which tells me one set of difference? Am I failing but getting better, which tells me another set of difference? So this helps us look at movement within the category as opposed to just kind of rubber stamping F. So I think it's a great question. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. It looks like John also has a question for you. How would you characterize the conversations or negotiations with the local teacher union as CMSD moved toward a portfolio model?
So you can Google cleveland.com and see for yourself. It was tough. You know, we were making an aggressive reform over the last 5 years. It was very contentious. It moved from a centralized power structure, which also allowed the union to have a centralized power structure, to now a very decentralized one where buildings were doing a number of things. I had board meetings with 900 people in them when I was taking corrective action on a school. I had members holding candles and wearing black in protest. You know, we came close to a strike a couple of years ago, but we've moved through it. And now we have a much improved labor climate. And I would argue, and we're going to move to this actually in a few moments, but I would argue because we now are very deliberate, whether people like the decisions or not, they know what they are and how they're made, and they don't feel like surprises in the way they used to when we were doing things much more organically.
Well, thank you for sharing that, Eric. And we do invite our attendees to post more questions. In the meantime, we did have some more questions from our registrants. And one of them was, how do you handle the copious amounts of data and effectively communicate the information out to the community and staff?
So I actually think that leads us really nicely into our last couple of sections. And because of time, I'm going to encourage that maybe, Star, you and I can build that into how we present the next content.
I think it's a great idea, Eric.
Okay, thank you. We do have another question from Mark. What was the role of the Board of Education in moving toward a portfolio model?
So, Mark, my board is fully engaged in our portfolio strategy. My mayor was also engaged, as were faith leaders, charter leaders, ultimately our union. If you're interested more in our specific strategy, we shared a link about the Cleveland plan a few minutes earlier that gives you an executive summary of what our strategy is and how we got there.
Okay, thank you. I think we will go ahead. Was there something else to add before we move ahead with the presentation? Okay. Why don't we go ahead and continue on? Star and Eric, thank you.
Great. Thanks, Jackie. All right, so section 2 of 3, we wanted to really dive into what do we mean by school performance policy. At this point, you've done the hard work of defining school quality, but the question is, to what end? The school performance policy is really about bringing to life the so what of your district's school quality framework. Families and school teams will want to know, so what? My school is rated a B or an F. District decision makers, similarly, will want to know, so what do we do that now that we know we have a quarter of our schools that are rated D or lower, or a quarter of our schools that are in the high-performing bracket? So this is really about answering that question of so what. There's 2 big things that can come out of that reflection. First, most districts take a moment to set a bold, measurable goal to really serve as the North Star for their work. And secondly, they spend time really focusing on describing the circumstances in which school performance will warrant an intervention into a school, thus building out a playbook for how your district will move students into higher performing seats over time. On the screen now are a couple of examples, in addition to the example that Eric already shared from Cleveland, of big goals that districts have set. And this is really about bringing the school quality ratings to a focal point so that all of your stakeholders in the community can rally around the goal that you're working towards in your decision-making process. Once that goal's been set, the work turns to your building out your playbook of school actions. And there are really 5 main categories that have emerged as you scan across the country as to what sort of actions districts have put into place. For high-quality schools that already exist, a district can invest in expanding access to those schools by filling them to capacity via community outreach, or increasing acceptances if it's a selective admit school, or by expanding the number of classrooms or grade levels served at that school. So the first category of actions is really, how do you expand access to schools that are already high performing? For more surgical improvements to schools, and I saw in the chat function when people were reporting actions that they've seen districts take, there were examples of this. There is a category that we called targeted support, such as facilitating the adoption of proven school model like an international baccalaureate program, or expanding opportunities to innovate, or deliberately matching specific PD, as I saw some folks have done, to a school to address the needs of the educators in that building. For schools that are chronically struggling, the third category of actions are transformation, which can take the form of school redesign, such as what Cleveland has done with many of its high schools, enlisting turnaround operators, converting low-performing schools to high-performing charter schools. There's a number of different ways of transforming an existing school, and typically this is reserved for schools that are really struggling in performance. Of course, taking existing schools and turning them around is not always going to completely expand the options for students in a way that really meets the goals of your district. And so some districts focus on growing high-quality school options through new school creation. And this really can be done by importing school models from outside the district, so borrowing something that's already working somewhere else and starting it in your district, taking a model that's working in your district and replicating it, or designing from the ground up a new school model. And finally, closing or merging schools is really the last set of actions that you see districts taking. And these can be quite controversial for a number of reasons. And so many districts find that pairing a closure with a transformation or with the opening of a new high-quality school and phasing out schools over time is more effective than shuttering schools immediately with no replacement. There is a blog post that is being shared in the chat function by the Dell Foundation called "There's More Than One Way to Grow Great Schools." And I'd encourage you to visit that post because it provides real newspaper clippings from districts across the country that have utilized examples of these levers in ways that have really been challenging but also been quite successful for increasing access to high-quality schools. And I would just say, just as the players and coaches on a football team need to be aligned around what each play entails when it's called on the field, it's critical that your district define what each school action entails. And there's really 2 main aspects that I would encourage you to focus on. One is be clear on the evidence of why a given intervention will improve students' access to high-quality schools and what that means for the expectations of the schools receiving that intervention. And then secondly, really take the time to quantify and calculate the resources required to deliver and sustain over time a given intervention. And by resources, we don't just mean the dollars, but also the physical assets, the project management capacity, the leadership time, the total lifetime costs of technology that are associated with these interventions. So this next slide shows you what comes out of the school performance policy work. It's building a mapping between your school quality ratings on the left side and potential school actions on the right side. And so in this example, you see that this hypothetical district says that schools that come out as rated A or B are eligible for 3 potential actions: replication, expansion of seats, filling schools to capacity. Whereas on the flip side, D and F rated schools are eligible for redesign, turnaround, or closure. And this is a really important step, as the poll question talked about, to improve clarity for stakeholders and really reduce the cognitive load put on decision makers each year by establishing some bright lines around what schools are eligible for and when they're eligible for those decisions. I'm going to skip this example because I know, Eric, you will go into more about Cleveland, but happy offline to share additional examples of what folks have done in other districts outside of Cleveland. But just to close, I would say a few tips from the field. First, as we did in Cleveland, it's quite helpful that you take stock of where you've been. So as we mentioned at the start, you're probably already doing this implicitly in your district. And so take time to reflect with your senior team and with other district stakeholders about what interventions have already been put in place, what were the circumstances in which those were utilized. And in doing that, it's also often you'll find where there are gaps in your toolkit that need to be filled based on the strategic priorities of your district. Secondly, it's really valuable to consider the bright lines you can draw, often at the highest and lowest performance tiers. These really should be multi-year commitments to provide certainty and consistent boundaries for school leaders and staff, for parents, and for the community. So it's about the guarantee so that people can plan accordingly around the policy that you've set. And finally, this is really a great place to test and learn. You can use an iterative policy design process that involves quick prototyping, literally taking your existing school data and running it through hypothetical policy guidelines to see where schools shake out. And it can really, by doing this, help surface areas of misalignment among your leadership team and build policies that are neither too prescriptive, which doesn't allow for the needed discretion and judgment in this decision making, nor too expansive, which often means that too many schools are eligible for too many actions and doesn't serve the purpose of narrowing and focusing the decision making work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Eric to talk about how this has played out in Cleveland.
Thanks, Star. So when we asked the survey questions at the beginning, have your district leadership team taken actions to promote high-performing or improve low-performing schools, large numbers of people answered yes in the top 2 categories. And then you shared a number of lists of activities. But then when we asked about a clear map, the numbers were much lower. And one of the things that I would say we learned in Cleveland is that we were trying a great deal of things to meet our bold goals, but we weren't doing them in a systematic kind of way. In our early years, we were picking a different intervention every time we said, well, what are we going to do about this school? And we design something, or we go find a model, or we turn it over to somebody. But it wasn't in a deliberate way. So a few years ago, we paused and looked at the different decisions we made and created this list of portfolio decisions. I really want to point out here also that we almost often think of this as, what do you do with your lowest performing schools? But in every one of the examples that you've seen, Philadelphia's, ours, and others, hopefully you're going to see that this is thinking about your entire portfolio. So how do you take advantage of your highest performing schools and expand those seats, or replicate them and use them as models? And how do you think about that good to great space in the middle? This is also a place, one of the questions posed early on was, how do you deal with a contentious political environment? And we all have our own political environment. This is a place where you can engage people in creating the list of strategies and building understanding about what the strategies are and why they are needed. I mentioned earlier to the question about, working with the union. The union doesn't agree with every single action, and so in our Take Corrective Action for Failing Schools category, we have something called Designate an Investment School, where we have some pretty liberal rights around redesigning the school, and sometimes with implications on our teachers' contract. The union doesn't like it, but at least they know it is an action, and when we describe it, we have an entry point with shared understanding. So this list is really important to us because this is the set of decisions that we're willing to make dependent upon a school's performance. You'll notice we also on our list have thinking about our charter schools. So for us, we work through a 4-step process to think about how we're going to categorize our schools. So first we decide what schools are in play for some kind of intervention. We have a commitment that once we've made a decision, we will stick with that decision for a minimum of 3 years and see what happens over time in that school. So the first thing we do is screen out all of those schools that are already in flight or in play. They have something going on. We then sort our schools into those 4 categories that you saw earlier: high-performing, mid-performing, low-performing, and failing. And since tripling the number of high-performing seats and eliminating failing schools is our big goal, it's important that we think about that in our decision-making process, and then think about those categories. In the 3rd step, we then utilize our comparative data and say, okay, so we've got this group of schools that are failing. Are there some that are getting worse? Are there some that are getting better, and maybe we should continue to give them opportunity? Are there some that are just stuck, and that helps us prioritize? And then finally, we add in the 4th step other contextual data. So what if it is a low-performing school but with really strong enrollment? That's a very different decision than a low-performing school that also has declining enrollment and kids are leaving the school. One of them you might close. Another one you might phase in a new program, as just an example. So these steps guard us against becoming overly rigid in our decision-making, but do ensure that we take into account all of the pieces of our framework, including the qualitative understanding of performance and the interdependencies of these different pieces as they move together. And so I'll turn it back to Star for the last portion of this, which is the actual decision process itself.
Thanks, Eric. So to continue our sports analogy, you've defined success, you've got a playbook to achieve it, and now it's game day. The school decision process is about bringing it all together so that your district stakeholders are all aligned around the question, the answer to the question, now what do we do? There are 5 broad steps that I want to talk through as it relates to the school decision-making process. And just like the players, coaches, referees, fans can rely on a football game to start with a coin toss, to run for 4 quarters, to end with a victor identified based on points earned, so too do you want your district stakeholders to be able to count on a predictable calendar of decision-making about schools each year. Eric's going to talk through each one of these steps as it relates to the process that's underway in Cleveland, literally as we speak, but let me orient you to the big picture of the process. Broadly, steps 1 and 2 are about clarifying the decision-making terrain. So in step 1, district teams refresh the school quality ratings and conduct a scan of forces shaping the district and the broader community, because these decisions obviously are not being made in a vacuum. And the output of step 1, analyze and the portfolio and align on priorities, is a clear set of priorities that give districts the direction to inform their decision-making process. Step 2 then establishes the resource parameters for the decision-making process. It really challenges your team around the decision-making table in a district to take stock not only of the monetary resources that you have at your disposal, but also the project leadership capacity, the leadership time and attention, and the political will that's present that can be deployed against some of your strategic goals. Coming out of step 2, a district ideally sets up an upper bound for the number and scale of school actions it might take in a given year, and that really helps focus the decision-making that and scenario analysis that takes place in the next step. Step 3 is the heart of the decision-making process, and while it's illustrated as a single step, in reality it's an iterative set of dynamic working sessions, really among a thoughtfully convened group of stakeholders. that are focused on translating the district's priorities into a feasible set of recommended school actions, with the goal of these decisions, of course, being maximizing the number of students in high-performing schools given the resources available. Step 4 acknowledges the importance of bringing closure to these iterative, dynamic conversations about potential scenarios by explicitly finalizing decisions about school actions for the upcoming school year and really investing in thorough communication to relevant stakeholders and impacted stakeholders about those decisions. You might have noticed in the Cleveland menu of school actions, there was take no portfolio action as one of the menu options listed for each category of school performance. And I know there's real intention brought to making sure that all schools understand where they stand coming out of this decision-making process, whether or not there's going to be a major intervention taken in them in a given school year. And then the final step acknowledges the power of reflection and continuous improvement, not only of this process, but of the school performance framework and the school performance policy that underlie and inform this process. One note about the timing that's mentioned here. You'll see that many districts can corral this decision-making process into about 3 months of the year, from September to November. And these are important dates from a timing perspective because they allow decisions to be fed by the latest school-level testing data, which is often fully available to districts by September or so, and wraps up decision-making early enough to feed other major strategic processes like enrollment projections, school budgeting, school staffing, which often really kick into high gear in the January and February period. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Eric, to talk through this in Cleveland.
Great, thank you. So now let's just take some time and put it together. And what we've done for you is I'm going to talk through the steps as we are implementing them in Cleveland and actually populate a simulation of the school performance framework so that you can see it built out as we work through it. So somehow I got a blank here. I'm sorry, I don't see the slide, so I don't know what the audience is seeing. I see just a blank slide.
Okay, I can project them. We're on slide 1, analyze the portfolio and align priorities.
Thank you. I don't know what happened, but I'll play it a little blind in the dark. So first of all, right now in this September, as a district, we took a look at our landscape, and this is another place to the question of managing the politic. This is another place where you can be smart about managing your politic. And so this is a place, for example, in Cleveland, we have a mayoral election right now, and the mayor is running against a city council member. And so this may be a place where you think about, do you want to weigh into doing some kind of intervention in that council space? Didn't happen to be one of our decisions, but it is a place where you can set priorities not only inside of your organization, but outside of them. For us, we started by looking at the trend data from the last 3 years, as I've mentioned before. We looked at our larger environment and came to some decisions. So, for example, Ohio has had a very unstable accountability system for the last 3 out of 4 years because of the changing testing environment, but it's now much more stable and much more rigorous. That means we have a far larger number of failing and low-performing schools than we did on the older, easier assessments. So we're going to focus on intervening in some of those lowest-performing schools. That's a priority for us. We also, in Cleveland, have invested really heavily in our high schools over the past several years. So this year, we're going to focus more on our K-8 space as opposed to our high school space. So those are some examples of our first step where we are analyzing the portfolio and aligning our priorities around that. Star, if you can move to the next slide.
Yep.
We also have to ask ourselves the questions of all the things we could do, what must we do? So in CMSD, once we make a decision, we commit to implementing that decision for at least 3 years, consistent with our performance framework model. So that means we have a large number of school decisions from the previous 3 years that are already in play or in some form of process. So we consider the resources we've already invested, the money to start new models, the added costs by phasing a school in or out as opposed to a simple closure, the time and capacity of our school design team, because if you're going to design schools, you have to have the team to support them. Other important work going on in the district. We are also simultaneously doing aggressive work on reorienting the central office around the support side of the work. That takes time and capacity. And so because of all of those things, we have created what we consider a very small resource envelope for the coming year. We're going to really focus on only a few critical decisions. So if you think about the conversation we had on the last slide, now we've narrowed to decision-making focused on schools that are not already in play, schools that are on the low-performing side of the spectrum over time, schools that are primarily K-8, and now the most critical few of them. And Star, if you could move us again. So the third step is the one that I really want to spend a little bit of time unpacking. And this goes to the person who asked about how do you manage all of this data and information. And I had asked that we hold this question. So what I've done here is created a simulation of our schools as we lay out this data to find out, so who are those critical few schools that we're going to interact with. And so, Star, if you'd move us to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So we start by populating the schools onto the grid. And so if you look at the grid on your screen, you can see that we have far fewer schools in the highest performing and the mid-performing, far more in the low-performing and failing. You can also see that using the 9-square matrix, we can define the differences between them. So we have some schools on the failing rubric that are also in the below average and declining. There's 5 of them there, compared to 4 of them at the top right of that category, which is above average and improving. So this really, first blush, really says, okay, how does the whole group of schools do? So then moving to the next slide, our next step is to remove all of the schools that are already in some form of active portfolio decision. And so you can see that we've graded these out and taken them off of the grid. And so we're starting to call through the choices we could make. Continuing to move forward, I mentioned previously that we had invested heavily in our high schools over the past decade and shifting to K-8. So now we're taking another swipe and removing the high schools from the decision-making grid so that they're also not schools we're considering. And instead now only focusing on K-8 schools. And then finally, you'll notice we grayed out the entire left side because we've decided we're going to focus on lowest performing schools. And so we're looking now only at a very few number of schools that are either low performing or failing entirely. And so once you have this data feeding and you have a very clear system, you're able to pretty quickly come down to which schools meet the priorities you set and the resources you have. And so now we're taking a look at what are we going to do with the about 10 or so schools that are remaining left here on the chart. These are the schools then we would go back to our decision guide and say, what are the decisions we could make with these failing schools, including doing nothing this year? What are the decisions we could make with our low-performing schools, including doing nothing this year? So if you look again on the bottom left of the failing category, there are 5 schools that are sitting in that bucket. We could decide that we're going to close those schools. We could decide we're going to replace those schools, any number of other interventions. But now we've honed in on 5 schools that are not only failing, but they're getting worse, and they're worse than their peers. These became our highest priority for the coming year. And then, Star, if you can move us to the November portion of the cycle. So where we are right now is to decide, so what are the scenarios we might play out, and what other information do we need to make these decisions? So, for example, Cleveland has also been on a aggressive school building replacement building. 3 of those schools are in almost brand new buildings. We're clearly not going to close them and walk away from them. So we're not going to use that strategy off of our guide. 2 of them are actually just about to go through construction, and so we are actually using a school redesign strategy with those tools concurrent with our those schools concurrent with our capital program and design. So really thinking deliberately about what other things matter here. What does the enrollment look like in these schools? Is it a low-performing school that's got 800 kids? Because that's a very different problem with a low-performing school that has only 200 kids and that might be able to merge with another one. this is also the place where we start thinking about communication. And so we've really paid a great deal of effort into when and how we communicate. So Star mentioned that these decisions are being made for us in September through November. That means we have then November through the following school year to implement these decisions. That means also that we have the really careful opportunity of how do we communicate with our mayor and the council members for the wards those schools are in. How do we communicate with the teachers and the school staff? What's the principal's role in communicating with parents and community? A core part of the portfolio strategy is the principal co-owning these kinds of decisions. What is the hand-holding that we're going to provide for these schools if we're going to close a school? Last year we merged 2 schools together, and so what was the enrollment and choice strategy that supported students and families as soon as the decision was made all the way through the next fall when they enrolled in school? And making sure that these are communicated in a way that the public understands not only the end result, but how did we get here and what is our plan to move forward. And then finally, on the last slide, as Star mentioned, we found it really valuable to have a deliberate point of reflection for 2 things at the end of the year. One is asking ourselves, where can we improve the portfolio management approach itself? And so if you think about that 9-box grid that I showed you, we did not originally have that because on our old state assessment system, the original school performance framework with its 4 categories of failing, low performing, mid performing, and high performing were sufficient. But when the new state report card was put in place and lots more schools fell into a single category of failing, we then needed a better way to discriminate with inside of it. And so that was an improvement in the system. And we take time every year to think about that improvement. We also take time to look at which of the interventions on our guides seem to be getting better results collectively and which ones do not, so that we can update the policy guide over time and say, we think we should pause on a particular strategy and really unpack, is it doing what we think? Which by having the guide and articulating them has made it much easier for us to study them. We also use May and June for a final gut check. So we've made this decision about the school, but the school's still been active all year long. Has anything significant changed that would change our point of view before we go into the summer months and ready for the following school year? And so it's really important for us to both use this as a learning opportunity, but also use it as an opportunity for a final gut check of the decisions that have been made and are about to be fully executed. So with that, I know we've moved through a lot of content quickly. It was really important for Star and I that we had some time left for questions, which we do. So I'm going to turn it back to our moderators to field questions, and hopefully we've provided enough depth that you feel like you know where to start, but we've also given you time to ask things most important to you.
Thank you so much, Star and Eric, and for that detailed description of the Cleveland Metropolitan School District. And before we move to our questions, and we have a few in our questions pod, we'd like to hear from Mike at the Texas Education Agency.
Great, thank you, Jackie. And Susan, Eric, and Star, thank you as well for your insights today. So the Texas Education Agency was interested in figuring out how to support school districts, specifically superintendents and other cabinet level leaders, to work through the process of change management as far as their district operating system goes. So what we decided to focus on was what we're calling the System of Great Schools approach. And what this ties into is the 4 strategic priorities that TEA has defined through their strategic planning process. And while I believe SGS as a whole can touch on all 4 priorities, we have bucketed it into strategic priority number 4, which is improve low-performing schools. And while we are focusing on SGS to improve low-performing schools, we also note that one of the ways to do that is to leverage the highest performing schools in districts. So we do put that messaging out as well. What we did to first reach out to our districts and see what districts might this be a good strategy in was we codified and defined what a superintendent who wants to move towards a system of great schools theory of action would believe in. So a system of great schools district superintendent will support educators to design and lead high-quality schools. He or she will empower families with quality options and informed choices. And he or she will focus central office on creating the conditions to unlock innovation and support schools. And the idea here is that an SGS school district or a system of great schools school district will focus on supporting and lifting up schools rather than focusing on an oversight compliance type role. So further, what we did to bucket out what type of work might exist and to also help districts figure out what their strengths and opportunities are related to moving towards the system was we codified and defined 6 levers of change. Any of you who saw the previous information about the Center on Reinventing Public Education, we did look towards their 7 strategies and look to that to kind of distill it down to what we thought might work the best here in Texas. So the 6 levers of change that we've defined were establish and administer school review and planning processes, and that's pretty much the entirety of what today's presentation has been about. Really understanding how to review the schools and plan and take actions to improve your lowest performing schools and leverage your highest performing schools. We talk about develop and expanding great schooling options. Lever number 3 is helping families understand and navigate their school and program choices. Lever 4 is reimagine central services to support school-based decision making. Lever 5 is build an ecosystem of effective school support and talent providers. And lever 6 is align civic partners and engage the community. What we move into next is a more thorough description of what we've kind of built out as the System of Great Schools Network. And it's important to note here that the network that we built out, we don't pretend like this is perfect and it's set. We acknowledge that we are in a pilot year and we are growing. We've been looking to our 8 districts who are members of Cohort 1 of the district to support us in making this program as beneficial to districts as possible. Districts joined this network through an application process, and our goal was not to find the districts that were doing the most substantial, innovative things, although we do have some, but our goal was to find districts who had a very high level of will towards moving to this type of model, and our goal was to help them build the skill and capacity that they might need to get there. So like I said, we have 8 districts that are members of Cohort 1 of the network. Each cohort will last for 24 months, and we plan to invite 6 new districts every year. So there will be 1 overlap year between each cohort. Districts that are members of the network receive consultative support. This begins with the matching of an executive advisor. Our executive advisors are former superintendents, deputy superintendents, and other leaders from districts across the country who have implemented specific strategies related to the System of Great Schools work. We support them through a readiness assessment, which monitors strengths and opportunities. We help them develop a roadmap towards implementation, and we provide 24 months of ongoing support and guidance. In addition to that, we've been working to build out a professional learning community so that districts can stay connected with one another. Texas is a very big state, so we did have to figure out tools and forums and systems to allow our districts to talk with each other, as well as to talk to our leaders from across the country to help us build the capacity within Texas to do this work moving forward. In addition to that, we've been working with some of our partners to build out a toolkit of resources on a website that will be posted on the final slide here, and that's systemofgreatschools.org. And that is available to the public. The only thing that the public can't access is the forum where our community of practitioners and districts can communicate with each other. There's a number of other things that go into this. On my end, what I try to do with TEA is to make sure that we are making the process as simple as possible for our districts, removing as much red tape as we are legally allowed to waive, but also monitoring to make sure that not too much is getting away from us. So these are the districts that have joined Cohort 1 that have been invited and did accept. Districts that join the network make a commitment to not see this as an initiative, but to see this as truly a change in the district's theory of action and how they operate. So this is not something that a district should join and just think it's going to happen on its own. All of our districts have dedicated a substantial amount of internal capacity towards this work. So we have El Paso, Midland, Fort Worth, Manor, Spring Branch, San Antonio, South San Antonio, and Galveston. Galveston is our smallest district with just under 8,000 students, and Fort Worth is our largest district with about 88,000 students. So we are working to show that this work can happen in varying size districts. So for more information, please visit the TEA website, tea.texas.gov/SGS, and that will direct you towards some more information as well as to the toolkit website that I mentioned earlier. If you have any follow-up questions for me personally about how the Texas Education Agency is supporting our 1,207 districts across the state, you can email me directly.
Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you. I want to acknowledge our participants. We still have quite a few people on, and we did want to go ahead and go to a second question and answer. But of course, if you do need to leave the webinar, we do request that you take and complete the stakeholder feedback survey. And I also, again, want to thank our presenters. It was such a rich, full conversation today. And we do have a couple of questions that I think will take a few minutes to address. Elise asked a little earlier and asked if Cleveland had a Gantt chart cataloging all the work that could be shared.
Sure, we would be happy to share. We have built out a number of tools that sit behind this, and the top one is a Gantt chart that really has what we call above-the-line decisions, so the strategic decisions, and then below that has what are the technical pieces of work that have to happen. So as you think about analyzing the portfolio and aligning on your priorities, what are the strategic things you need to do there? What are the technical things that should inform that? I would be happy to share, and I'll ask that we put my email address up for anyone who's interested, but I would be happy to share any of the materials and resources we have. To Star's point, please don't reinvent the wheel. Take our stuff apart and put it back together better so that we all learn.
Thank you. Thanks for your willingness to share, Eric. That's great. And we had another question from John about building level autonomy. He says it strikes him as the core tenet of the portfolio model, and he seemed as though the CMSD was largely about district level performance management systems and practices. Could you share a little bit more about what role autonomy plays at CMSD?
Sure. So today's webinar really focused pretty specifically on performance-based accountability, which is a core element of the portfolio mindset. But I would argue the slide that you saw both in Susan's presentation and in mine, that there are 7 core elements of the portfolio strategy that all work with each other. 3 of those are built around the notion of empowering schools. So school autonomy, which includes schools being able to select their own staff, schools being able to make decisions about their own budget, schools being able to make decisions about curriculum. We've defined autonomy in Cleveland as a menu of options from which schools can choose. You'll have to define your own version of that. And then also in autonomy, we actually have really tried to create space for schools to seek waivers from board policy, waivers from our union contract, and even some waivers from state law. Our state's been very supportive of our work in Cleveland, and we have some unique legislation that allows me to petition the state for school or district waivers of education law in some circumstances. That really focuses on things like time, student grouping, teacher resources, things of those natures. So that it is a big portion of our strategy. It is a different set of work, and I'd be happy to follow up with anyone offline.
Okay, well, thank you so much, and we're going to go ahead and conclude our webinar today. We really appreciate hearing from Susan, Eric, Star, and Mike, and all of our participants for joining us today and for your interaction with us in the polls and the chat pod. And a participant asked about the archive, and yes, this was recorded and will be archived. And we do invite you to complete our stakeholder feedback survey and follow the REL Southwest on Twitter and our website. And in addition, Eric and others have shared their email and their Twitter in our chat pod. So thanks again for joining us today, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.